we believe they came in while we were out, waited for us to go to bed and sleep, and took JonBenet from her room.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science on the 29th of December 2019. It's the 5th day of Christmas, and on the 5th day of Christmas my true love sent to me 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. Now in a previous episode we spoke about the 4 blackbirds or four calling birds, the difference of interpretation there. Well, there's also a disparity with the 5 golden rings. In some songs it's 5 gold rings. There's also 5 hares running. And so you've got a totally different interpretation there as well, just of the same song. You've got the slight difference between gold rings and golden rings, and then you've got the complete difference with hares running. And in the previous lyric that we looked at, we had calling birds conflated with collie birds, and it sounds the same but they're completely different. A blackbird is totally different to a mockingbird, and you get these kinds of subtleties in true crime as well. You get incidental or accidental misrepresentation or even misunderstanding. You heard something wrong, it was conveyed by accident or understood erroneously or whatever. But then you also have a manufactured mistake where somebody purposely decides, I don't like the way this sounds, I'm going to say it in a different way. It's going to play better, it's going to be a better song. And it's important to bear in mind that that exists as well. We'll be covering some of this stuff over the course of the next couple of episodes. There's still 3 episodes to go after this one, being Team Ramsey. I don't know what accessory means, that's episode 4, and then the final episode to do with the lawsuit and the last photo. Before we get to today's episode, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do. This is a channel that isn't called True Crime Rocket Science for nothing. It deals with facts, it deals with sober analysis, it deals with logic and psychology, it deals with the human condition, but above all, we are the true crime channel. If there are any errors in True Crime Rocket Science, we're very happy to get that information and update and fine-tune and improve the narrative that we have on the particular cases. And I use the we not by mistake, it's a collaborative effort. A lot of the information I have I dig for and I look for, but I also have a lot of help from people who contact me with information, some people that I know very well, some people that I don't know very well, and so it is a collaborative effort. And one looks at what refutes science, better information. How are theories and theorems improved? Well, with a fine-tuning of information. What doesn't refute science? Well, feelings, religion, your favorite politician, a half-baked opinion after watching YouTube videos, or populism. Just because something's popular doesn't mean it's true, right? And so if that resonates with you, then this is the channel for you. Please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So after the trilogy of books that I wrote, The Craven Silence, co-wrote with Lisa Wilson, I then took the narrative forward into a trilogy called The Day After Christmas. And The Day After Christmas was both specific to literally the day after Christmas, literally the 26th of December, And it was also broadly symbolic of where we are right now. 23 years after this crime is kind of like also the day after Christmas, just expanded over time. And to say, well, where are we? Where are we 5 days after Christmas? Where are we 23 years after this case? And there is a kind of depressing element to that we not very far. In fact, we're nowhere in a sense. I know in the original narratives, I was looking at the day after Christmas literally second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, and eventually involving the entire morning, right? So, and that would be the first book. The book would basically deal in a microscopic way, but also in a kind of a global way, the events of the morning on the day after Christmas. And then the next book would sort of go a little bit further and just deal with the afternoon. You might not think a lot happened, but there were a lot of people involved, and there was a lot happening. There was a lot happening minute by minute, hour by hour. There were calls being made, monies being transferred, characters coming into the spiel and leaving it. And then there was what happened that night. How did the Ramseys sleep on the day after Christmas? Bearing in mind that their child had been kidnapped, according to them. Bearing in mind that their child had died. Where did they sleep in terms of the other child? Were they able to sleep? And so these were all kind of important questions to address. But there's also a kind of a broader aspect to the day after Christmas, and I want to deal with that first, which is just kind of the PR and the comments and the stuff on social media and the stuff in the media 23 years later, 20 years later, so many years later, where are we going? And we're kind of in a funny place where, despite the fact that those grand jury indictments, despite the fact that they're known, there's almost this pretense in some quarters that they're not known. There's initially the pretense that the Ramseys were exonerated and that they were the grand jury didn't vote to indict them. That pretense lasted until it didn't last. Then after that it was like, well maybe there wasn't enough information, but they were exonerated, and then that's all that mattered, and that was the new narrative. But people seem to forget that. And then I got a comment today on Crime Rocket by someone identifying themselves as guest, and the person says, if you're a nutritionist, you might be interested that the A&E special and Paula Woodward's book don't refer to the food as being pineapple. You can look for their sources there. Pineapple is a leap and an assumption not based upon evidence, and begun by the CBS documentary. And so what's interesting about this comment is it's referring kind of to sources and evidence, and then it's also referring to specific sources that are providing sources, and the sources are the A&E special and Paula Woodward's book. And if you want to get your information about the evidence, go there and you're going to get information about the pineapple. But if you go to the autopsy, and that's basically the ground zero of evidence in terms of the evidence in JonBenet, I mean, you're not going to get a better source than that. It refers to fragments of pineapple in JonBenet's gastrointestinal tract. It refers to light green tan vegetable or fruit material, and the person specifically, the coroner Dr. John Mayer specifically identifies it as fragments of pineapple. When Lou Smith interviewed John Ramsey, he asked him specifically, did JonBenet eat pineapple? When Lou Smith interviewed Patsy Ramsey, he asked her about the pineapple, and Patsy responded, I didn't put the bowl there, okay? I didn't put the bowl there. But the point is, John and Patsy were asked about pineapple. When Burke was interviewed as an 11-year-old by Dan Schuler, he was also asked, what was he looking at? And Burke answered, "It's a bowl of," and then he kind of sat back and he said, "Oh." And previous to that, he'd said to Dan Schuler his favorite food was pineapple. He'd said his own favorite snack was pineapple. And he also said that JonBenet ate pineapple. And whether you want to wash that away, it's a fact that pineapple was found at the crime scene. You can't be more explicit than that, that there are crime scene photos of a bowl of pineapple that's not been eaten to completion. And so when you look closely at this guest that's leaving this comment, what he's actually referring to is trying to get you off the pineapple conspiracy. That's what he's trying to make you think it is. And he's trying to lead you to an A&E special that's probably been funded by the Ramseys. If it's not been funded by the Ramseys, then they participate in it under the understanding that it's going to be about how the intruder theory is more likely, and because of that they participate, right? And then there's also Paula Woodward's book, which does exactly the same thing. So any time that you refer to these sources, they're not sources, it's apologia. And in the same way that you look at this song, the 12 Days of Christmas, what you really want to go to is, what is the original song? Not what is the song being sung now, not did gold rings come from golden rings, or did golden rings come from gold rings? What was the original song? That's what you want to get to. You want to get to the original source material, right? And the original source material are, guess what? The crime scene photos, and also the autopsy evidence. And then in extension to that, the fact that all three of the Ramseys were asked about pineapple is telling you that it's pretty significant, right? It's pretty significant that it's mentioned in the autopsy, it's alluded to in the autopsy, and then all three of the Ramseys are asked about it, and then it is actually in the kitchen as well. So when you have this poster saying something about, if you're a nutritionist, if you're some kind of expert nutritionist, you would know that the food isn't being referred to as pineapple. You don't need to be a nutritionist to look at a photo of a bowl of pineapple on a table. You don't need to be a nutritionist to understand the English language when someone is asking someone else about pineapple. You don't need to be an expert. It's quite simple. As simple as it is, there are some people who get caught up in these arguments, and those people aren't rocket scientists, right? There is an aspect to true crime that is more rocket sciencey. For example, when you make the argument that the torch isn't the murder weapon, and it wasn't even used on JonBenet's head, right? And there's quite a simple reason for that, is if you're going to make the argument that JonBenet didn't die of her head wounds, right, which is the argument made in the CBS documentary, then you've got to have a counter argument. And the counter argument is that whoever struck JonBenet didn't have to be very strong if they were striking her with a much longer object, right? So if it's a torch, you've got to gain momentum through your own arm. But if you've got a much longer object and you're swinging it like a golf stick, think about how far you can hit a golf ball with a golf club compared to maybe a tennis ball with a tennis racket. The one is shorter than the other, right? And so you get a lot more leverage and momentum through a longer object. And so something like even a baseball bat or a softball bat, you're going to get a lot more power in terms of the person executing the strike, right? But the tricky part comes in where you look at the autopsy evidence and you look at the brain trauma and the cracked skull, and you've now got to say, well, if you're going to make this contention that it wasn't the torch, then does this other object fit into this paradigm? Does it fit into the cracks in the skull and all that kind of thing? And the answer is that it does. And what it also does is you can see how something like a hard object like a torch, kind of a solid hard object like that, hitting a skull, and it's demonstrated in that CBS documentary, can cause a lot of damage, could and should cause brain damage if it's, struck like that. Whereas a baseball bat or a softball bat is kind of a lighter implement, if you want to call it that, or it's a lighter weapon. So just as it can strike quite hard, it can also bounce off quite easily. And because it is in some cases hollow, in the case of a aluminum bat, you can have a situation where the energy of the bat transfers to the skull in a way that is totally different to a much harder object. In other words, you can crack the outer surface, but then the energy dissipates. Just as when you're hitting a baseball, the energy dissipates into the ball, making the ball go forward and go through the air or whatever. And so the same thing happens with someone hitting the skull. The difference being the energy is then distributed through the skull, not into the brain tissue underneath. Why? Because the bat is much lighter. The impact is harder, but it's also a lighter impact behind it. So once the skull is in the is taking that impact, once the swinging of the club stops, in other words, at that point of impact, the energy that is releases quite quickly and in kind of an elastic way. Okay, and that is the difference between the impact of a torch and the impact of or flashlight and the impact of a softball bat. And that also explains why the trauma to JonBenet's brain wasn't actually that bad. She lost 2 teaspoons worth of blood in terms of brain tissue, but the actual bruising to her brain through the cerebral cortex, that's the outer layer, was very thin. It was only like 5 millimeters. But if she was hit by a hard object like a brick or a torch or just a heavy hard object, then it would have transferred, the momentum would have continued, it would have transferred through the broken skull and into the brain tissue, and you would have had very, very severe blood trauma, but you don't. And the words of the autopsy report refer to that. I was trying to make this point on Reddit, but the people there are so convinced that they are the experts. They've been covering this case for 20 years and they know better than anyone else. And then you say, how does a case remain unsolved for 20 years? Well, it's very hard to fill a cup that's already full. There's also been that counter argument about the snow, that if there was an intruder, they would have left footprints, right? Then the counter argument is that, well, the snow had already melted, and the snow on the patio area especially had already disappeared. And again, this is either a conscious effort to be ignorant, which it sometimes is, or it's just ignorance in plain. And where we get to this is, you didn't even need snow to make the argument that that there was no intruder. You didn't even need snow. And why I say that is, when you have frost, right, and you have frost in certain places at certain times of the year, it has the same effect of covering everything in a film of very kind of microscopic ice, in this case frost, right? And when you have that, it has exactly the same effect. From a distance, it's very clear whether someone has left footprints on this or not. It's a little bit like throwing paint on a floor, and it doesn't have to be very deep, it just has to be there. And you either step on it or you don't, and you can be a kindergarten person and say, I can see that someone stepped in the paint and walked away or not. That's how simple it is. So you don't even need snow. And in this case, you did have snow. You had trace snow. So what you literally had was snow in combination, trace snow in combination with frost. And the fact is that the policeman who arrived, I think it was Officer French, arrived, and then he saw the scene before the sun came up. So he arrived there very early in the morning, probably close to 6 a.m., before the sun had risen, and he arrived at the scene before anyone else, and he saw no footprints anywhere. he's advancing to the scene and he's not seeing footprints anywhere. And it was enough of a thing that he noticed that he mentioned to everybody else. And if that had just been taken at face value, this whole case could have changed and should have changed, because then you don't even have an intruder scenario, right? And ultimately, if you go from that point of the snow and the ice to what the grand jury did vote at the end of the day, they line up, don't they? So when we talk about the day after Christmas, we're talking about, yes, the events right around what happened, so including the ransom note. That's what happened after the crime. That's part of the pageantry after the crime, right? But we're also talking about the pageantry that is continuing to this day, the PR pageantry, the bogus documentaries. And one documentary that was quite interesting, that was a very different take on the whole thing, was Casting JonBenet, where you literally had a lot of little girls taking on the role of JonBenet. Some of them didn't even have blonde hair, but it was sort of like what it was kind of a mockumentary, basically saying everyone looking at this case is seeing their own reality. It's not reality, it's just the reality that people are seeing for themselves, that they want to see. And that's not true crime rocket science. That is just, that's transference, that's projection. That's being led by the hand to some populist theory based on almost PR and someone else's PR ploy that you've fallen for. But what does the actual evidence show? What is the actual what's the actual true crime rocket science of this case? And that's completely different. But let's get practical with this case and deal with some of the, obviously it's not exhaustive, but some of the things that happen kind of in the day and days after Christmas. And I think when you go through this information, the surprising thing, that the real mystery is why this case appears to be so mysterious. It's not mysterious at all. Well, why does it appear to be so mysterious? And so when you go through the days after Christmas, let's start off at December the 28th. Both of the Ramseys retained lawyers. John had a lawyer and so did Patsy. On the same day, Mike Bynum said that they would not consent to interviews. This was on December 28th. On the 1st of January, 4 days later, they would go on CNN and say, absolutely, we will absolutely cooperate with the authorities. We want to do everything possible to help them go where they need to go. Yes, of course. We're just not going to consent to interviews with the police for 4 months. If they had the option of not consenting to be interviewed, they didn't really have the option of refusing to be processed for things like fingerprints. That was kind of a protocol that was legally required. And so at 1447, on the 28th of December, the Ramseys were processed for fingerprints. Although they were doing the fingerprints, they weren't doing it at the Boulder Police Station. They were doing it instead at the Criminal Justice Center in Boulder. And this in itself is weird, because if you think about it, the Boulder police are at the Boulder Police Station. Now somebody's got to go to the Criminal Justice Center and do something there and sort of, chaperone the whole deal. Whereas if they were just at the police station, they would be, the resources are there. They don't need to sort of send resources somewhere, right? And what Detective Thomas noticed was, he said that John Ramsey looked nervous. He's not going to say anything, right? He's not there to make a statement. He's just there to give a fingerprint. So why is he nervous? And then Thomas also said that John Ramsey didn't say an unsolicited word. In other words, just another way of saying that John didn't say anything when he wasn't spoken to. And that, I'm just using my intuition here, but I'm guessing that John Ramsey was told by his lawyer, don't say anything, and so that's exactly what he did. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, except if you are genuinely looking for your daughter's killer, which is what is in the media now, that the Ramseys are still looking for the unknown killer of JonBenet. They're actively trying to investigate the killer. Well, you're at the police station, why wouldn't you talk? Why wouldn't you make unsolicited statements without being asked questions when you have the opportunity? Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you try to find out what's going on? And so naturally, Detective Thomas says exactly that. He says, I couldn't understand how someone whose child had been murdered would not ask detectives about progress. Thomas then recounts John leaving the room and then returning with Burke. Thomas describes John as shepherding Burke. Now, what's really interesting with this is Detective Thomas doesn't have any kind of agenda. Detective Thomas was never trying to implicate Burke. He was never trying to say Burke was involved. In his book, JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, Thomas instead makes the case against another member of the family. So there's no reason he would make this thing up about Burke. And yet you have this confirmation from Detective Thomas that John is shepherding Burke. Why is it necessary to shepherd Burke? I mean, Burke in his own interview said, he was moving on with his life. He was okay. He was kind of indifferent to the whole thing. So why would he need to be shepherded? But that's not all. I mean, the detective continues and he says that John was almost smothering Burke during processing and talking quietly into his ear. And you might think, well, that's just John being a good doting father. He's a attentive dad, is a sensitive guy. Him and Burke have a very close relationship. Yeah, and you can certainly make that argument. But you could also make the argument that John wasn't kind of the smothering type. He wasn't smothering towards his wife. He wasn't smothering towards his daughter. He just wasn't the smothering kind of guy. He's not that kind of person. And also that he's not the kind of guy who would often talk quietly into his son's ear just as a matter of course. And you could argue with that and say, no, he was that kind of father. Or you could argue that he was kind of a busy guy, that he had important interests to take care of, and he was kind of more preoccupied with other things a lot of the time. He was often on international business trips. And if you make that argument, you could say maybe this behavior here at the police station was different. Maybe if John was not that involved with his children generally, now he was suddenly very involved. So you could sort of make that contention and then say, what could this be pointing towards? Is it valid? Isn't it valid? But the point is that Thomas just noticed John appearing to smother Burke during this processing, talking quietly into Burke's ear. And what might he have been saying to Burke? What do you think John was saying to Burke in this sort of loaded situation where the police are there taking fingerprints and things are looking a certain way if you're a young boy? What do you think is being said there? And then Patsy appeared last, and she's got her attorney present as well. So just a simple thing like taking their fingerprints, they've kind of got their lawyers around them and John's shepherding Burke, and it's kind of quite controlled, wouldn't you say? And then you compare that to what they said on CNN, which I played that clip in the beginning of the first episode, just where there's this laughing assurance that of course we're going to work with the authorities, of course, from both Patsy and John. Absolutely we're going to, as soon as we get back to Boulder, we're going to be talking to them. Yes, absolutely. Everything that they want to know, we're gonna give them. And then there was like a dramatic moment when Patsy's fingerprinting was done. She looked at her blackened fingers, and Patsy is just a very kind of over the top extravagant person. There's just a lot of pageantry around Patsy, and just seeing her fingers black and dirty like this kind of horrified her. And Patsy kind of seemed to panic, and she sort of cried out, "I didn't kill my baby." And in Thomas's book he said, well, nobody asked her. No one said, "Did you kill JonBenet?" And Patsy answered, "No, I didn't kill my baby." Patsy just sort of almost like she was responding to the situation. She was responding to the situation of being fingerprinted. She was saying, "It feels like they think I did it." Right? That's what that's how it appears. And I don't think Patsy did kill JonBenet. So I think Patsy was being sincere, and I think Patsy was being honest in terms of what she was saying. And Patsy probably had every reason to feel kind of a little bit indignant, because she didn't. And she probably felt that the walls were moving in, and she probably was quite worried. But why would Patsy be more worried than anyone else? The fact that she had black ink on her fingers, why should that trigger her? Any ideas? And then at that moment when she sort of said those words, her lawyer, in Thomas's words, launched away from the wall, like literally almost like took off like a rocket, like at great speed, to be at her side as quickly as possible, and suddenly brought his face right to Patsy's ear and sort of whispered harshly into her ear. And what would he have said? Patsy's just said something that the lawyer kind of flies through the air like Superman, reaches her ear and whispers something urgently into her ear. What would he have said? And then Patsy didn't say another word during the entire session. What do you think the lawyer said to her? You could quite rightly look at this processing anecdote and shrug your shoulders and say, so what? People behave differently. Doesn't really mean anything. Sure, you can make that argument, but here's another one. While the Ramseys are being processed for forensic evidence, when we say while, we mean at the same time, simultaneous to that, coordinated with this, right? Patsy's sister stages a one-woman raid on the crime scene. So you've also got to think, isn't it convenient that this whole processing doesn't happen at the Boulder Police? And the fact that it doesn't happen at the Boulder Police means resources are sort of sent somewhere else, because you've now got to create a processing center dislocated from where it normally is, right? It's a little bit like you want to have a party at your home, but then someone says, no, can we have the party somewhere else? But you're the one throwing the party. Well, that means you've now got to cook meals and then take the food to this other location. And that requires manpower. That requires kind of being stretched a little bit thin. It requires being sort of taken. It's going to take more time as well to do it that way. In any event, while this is happening, there's this raid of the crime scene by somebody very, very close to Patsy, arguably the person closest to her, and it's her sister. And on the one hand, there's nothing wrong with what's going on here. Pam did have permission to go to the crime scene, and so there's nothing strange about that. She was allowed to go, and so she went. But she went under the pretext of fetching clothes for JonBenet's funeral. So you can imagine if you were the police and Patsy's sister said, is it okay if I get JonBenet's clothes? I'm not sure if it was clothes for JonBenet's funeral in terms of for JonBenet, because JonBenet was ultimately dressed in sort of pageant clothing. I don't know if it was that, or whether it was getting Patsy's clothing for Patsy, or whatever it was. But the point being, it was under the pretext of fetching clothing for a funeral. But then a couple of strange things happened. Patsy's sister was dressed as a police officer to disguise her identity, and then the items scavenged from the crime scene weren't limited to clothing. So, Pam's kind of saying, I need to go to get clothes, but then she doesn't only get clothes, right? Now, I think when I originally came across this information, it seemed a bit dodgy to me, the whole thing of dressing as a police officer. I don't think so much anymore. In the Patrick Frazee case, you actually had Crystal Kenny, enter the crime scene. I think that was on like December the 20th, and she also was dressed in I think sort of a CBI outfit, CBI clothing, and that was to kind of protect her identity from the media, but basically for her to protect her identity. And so if someone is entering the crime scene wearing police clothing, well, if anything, that's simply just confirming that they have permission from the authorities to be there, to have access to the crime scene. The difference is Crystal Kenny didn't take anything from the crime scene. She went in and she pointed things out. And that's kind of the main difference here. Now you might say, so what if Pam just went into the house and took some clothes? No big deal. And maybe she picked up something else. Maybe she picked up a paperback, and maybe she picked up this and that. It's no big deal. So what? Well, it's not so what. This is an unsolved case 23 years later, and this is one of the reasons why. Because the crime scene was contaminated before, during, and after the crime. That's the problem. And this is a very serious problem because you already had the police on scene. And this is where it kind of gets murky, where Steve Thomas says, Thomas doesn't just say that Pam entered the crime scene and took some clothes. He describes it as a raid. It's the kind of term that the cops sometimes use when they do a drug bust. They raid the premises of a drug den, right? It's a raid. It's like it's an organized assault. It's almost like a battle, right? And Thomas basically compares this raid to the damage or compromise of burning the whole place down. He's basically saying Pam couldn't have done a better job of destroying what remained of the crime scene than if she'd literally torched the Ramsey home. If she'd set the home on fire, she couldn't have done a better job than the job that she did do. And then curiously, when a Boulder detective, Chromiak, realized what was happening, an officer called Everett told her, don't worry about it. And one's got to wonder what is going on there. One's got to wonder what's going on with Everett, that he's permitting this. Are you saying it's against his better judgment, or is there something else going on there? Chromiak was reassured that the raid was okay because the detectives already know who did it. And then Patsy's sister emerged with a big cardboard box full to the brim, then made another half dozen trips inside. So this wasn't just clothing, it also wasn't just a little bit of clothing, it was a lot. And without sort of being a conspiracy theorist and sort of making it very sort of like very dramatic, you could have had a situation where Everett kind of thought, well, you know what, they know kind of what happened here, they know who's responsible, so it doesn't really matter what you take. This is kind of a slam dunk case, which is also what Lou Smith said. And so that kind of arrogance, maybe someone was naive, they allowed this pillaging of the crime scene to take place, and that was done in possibly ignorance from a police force that was, that crime, that murder was the first murder that year in Boulder. Bear in mind, it's literally 4 or 5 days to the end of the year, and this is the first murder. So it gives you an idea how unpracticed the Boulder cops were in, maintaining a crime scene. And when you look at the kind of policemen standing around the crime scene, they don't exactly inspire confidence. According to Steve Thomas, the backseat of the police car was stuffed like a steamer trunk with boxes, bags and suitcases. Everett kept only a general inventory of what was removed, so we didn't really even know exactly what was removed. But the question is, were books removed too? And this is an important question because when Detective Lou Smith, went through the crime scene and he kind of meticulously went through it, studying all the photographs, he came across the Mindhunter book written by FBI profiler John Douglas. So he found that in the crime scene photos, and yet the book was subsequently not on any evidence list, and it was also not kind of acknowledged. It was like the claim was made that the book wasn't in the house to begin with. So how can a book appear in crime scene photos but not in the crime? And then you come back to the one-person raid of this crime scene, you say, well, did it really matter? Yes, it did. And so that was the end of the 28th of December. The Ramseys from there went and met with their attorneys, Brian Morgan and Patrick Burke, at the Fernie's home. And 2 months later, Patsy would get a second lawyer. That was University of Colorado law professor P. Furman to join Patrick Burke. Then we go to December 29th, and so on this day the Ramseys kind of had a memorial service. It wasn't a funeral, but it was a memorial service, and it was held at the Episcopal Church in Boulder on the same day as Patsy's 40th birthday. Of course, Patsy's sisters, including the crime scene raider, Pam and Polly, were at the service, and according to Steve Thomas, they sort of waved their hands extravagantly during the service, calling for divine intervention quite loudly inside the church. Outside, the scuffle kind of broke out with the jostling press, with a photographer. John Andrew kind of told Detective Thomas to get rid of them. Thomas didn't appreciate being spoken to in that way. He said that John Ramsey kind of extended a hand and said thank you. Didn't ask him to do anything, just said thank you, and they didn't actually make eye contact. And Detective Thomas said he sort of held onto John's hand quite tightly, waiting for John to sort of notice that that the detective was had concerns, let's put it that way. At the memorial service, John Ramsey stood up briefly and he related an anecdote, and what he did was he said that he'd missed one of JonBenet's performances where she'd received a medal, but now he was wearing that medal over his shirt and jacket. He was sort of showing people that he was wearing this medal. And I remember when I was researching the book on this, just thinking that was quite interesting, that John was kind of publicly giving himself a medal at a service to kind of remember his daughter who died kind of under his care. And we know what the charges, the indictments were actually, what the content of them ultimately were, and just the irony of John Ramsey giving himself a medal 3 or 4 days after Christmas. And then there was also the moment where Patsy hugged the Ramsey housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh. The housekeeper didn't actually know that she'd already been identified as the first suspect by Patsy. So here's Patsy hugging the housekeeper, and the housekeeper doesn't really even know kind of what's going on, that she's kind of been identified. And there's some kind of interesting photos of Patsy hugging people outside the door of the church, and John Ramsey appears to be smiling. Bill McReynolds, another suspect, was actually a guest speaker at the memorial service, I'd have to check my notes, but there was a change in Bill Reynolds's attitude to everything. I'm not sure if that happened at the actual funeral, which was literally. Then interestingly, John Ramsey mentioned sort of afterwards that the first time that he felt that he was being harassed by the media was at this memorial service on December the 29th. And then hours after that memorial service, the Ramseys flew by corporate jet, courtesy of Lockheed Martin, to Atlanta. Some people on Reddit were asking me about Lockheed Martin's ownership of the Ramsey home. If you look at that, just the fact that they were flown by corporate jet, courtesy of Lockheed Martin, doesn't that tell you something? I can't find the information now, and it's not the purpose of these videos to be like a narrative on its own. I'm really just making the case for just giving you a background of what was happening kind of in the aftermath. Well, that's what this episode's about. But I do remember someone kind of complaining. I'm not sure if it was Steve Thomas or Cola or whoever, but they felt that the memorial service was kind of orchestrated in terms of the media were actually sort of meant to be there. And the impression I kind of got was that the Ramseys weren't going to talk to the local media, but the memorial service was sort of supposed to serve as a kind of way that the media could kind of get their pound of flesh, so to speak. So the Ramseys weren't going to talk to the media, but the media kind of got something through the memorial service. They got the emotion, they got the sentiment, they got the drama. They just didn't get an actual statement from the Ramseys. So in this respect, it's kind of ironic, John saying he felt harassed by the media on that particular day. It's also, I think the same person who mentioned this, it could be Cola, I just can't quite remember, just saying that, after the service, Burke was sort of running around the graveyard, just like kind of having fun, running around the graveyard, just completely unaware of what had happened, or aware of what had happened and not particularly caring about it. If you ask me, during the day after Christmas, during the days after Christmas, and during the day after Christmas in a more mythical sense, in a more symbolic sense, the PR game that started with a ransom note is still ongoing. It's still happening right now. Across dozens and dozens of media articles and front page covers and stories and documentaries and books and movies and talk shows where it's Dr. Phil or Oprah, it kind of come back to the same thing. I'll talk to you if I'm allowed to talk about kind of the intruder narrative, and that's just happened now with the killing of JonBenet, the final suspects. It's sort of dressed up as an investigation, but what it's really dressed up as is a kind of thing where you're going to get your exclusive interview, but the exclusive interview is kind of going to be steered towards suspects. And who are the suspects? Well, they're not the Ramseys. The suspects are somebody else. And what's the story about? Well, it's about the intruder narrative. And then that becomes what the media are able to talk about. And what's interesting for me is, I listen to a podcast like this one, The Killing of JonBenet, and it's expertly done. It's very slick and sounds very good. And I think about how mine must sound. What is mine? How does my voice sound in this particular episode? I don't have a production designer or a budget or an executive producer or anything like that. And then you sort of think, somebody doesn't know this case, hearing the one version, hearing the other, they're going to take things by face value. They're going to take things on appearance, and that's what you're doing when you take the ransom note on, in terms of appearances. And that's really the bottom line of the JonBenet Ramsey case, it's all based on appearances, and there's a lesson to learn from that, is that not all things are the way they appear, are they? And that about does it for this episode. It's a longer one than usual. Bear in mind my book Christmas Star is out. It's already got 2 5-star reviews, so thanks for those. It deals with the last photo of JonBenet Ramsey and the implications of that bow that you see in her hair. The fact that the bow is in her hair at the whites, and that it's still in her hair when she's found the next morning, and just how it is referred to in the autopsy and what the implications are of that. So you can head over to Amazon. It's selling for $5.99 or free on if you're a member of Amazon Prime. There are 3 additional episodes in this series to go. There's Team Ramsey. I don't know what an accessory means. That's the 4th episode, and then the one dealing with the last photo is the 5th and last episode. If you're interested in watching them, please subscribe to this channel, like, share, leave a comment. There is additional analysis on Patreon just dealing with the murder weapon in more detail, and then looking at things like why the mainstream theory about this case, even by people who think the Ramseys are responsible, are full of crap. So if you're interested in that kind of deeper analysis, head on over to Patreon. That's Patreon/TCRS. And wherever you are in the world between the end of 2019 and 2020, I hope you're having a relaxed time. I hope you are just connecting to yourself and to those around you and to your world. And I will see you guys next time.